No, it's been great. It's been fun, having a really direct channel of communication with players, hearing feedback, bug reports, questions. I think it's a good way to get information out there and help players sort of feel engaged in the process of interacting with the development team and understanding some of our philosophies behind the changes we make. I think the one thing I've tried to avoid doing is I'd rather not have it become a place to find out lots of new information about the game or about the expansion. I think that should come through official forums and other more formal sites. I wonder that myself sometimes. So honestly, it was, yes, I was a practicing lawyer for several years. I was a hardcore WoW player from day one and really passionate about the game. And, alongside, while working professionally as an attorney, I was playing a lot of WoW in my spare time and got to know people who worked on the WoW development team just through the course of playing the game and offering feedback and having some interactions with them. And I had a couple of friends who worked at Blizzard who recommended that I apply one day, which I thought at the time was completely insane, but they talked me into it. And, one thing led to another, and the company took a chance on me, and I took a chance on them, in a sense, moving out to California for the job and telling myself I would, give it 1 year to see if I liked it and if I was any good at it, because I had no idea whether I would be. And here I am 5.5 years later, and no regrets. So yeah, I think we will have beta soon, because of course soon TM, as always. A lot of things will be soon TM, but no, we've been working hard since BlizzCon to really realize the vision and the things that we talked about in our presentation there. And obviously there's a taste of it that's playable for the press here today, and we hope to share a lot more of what we actually have to show in our world soon. No, I think it's really just a matter of realizing the vision that we talked about at BlizzCon. In our slides at the presentation in November, we talked about how we were going to have, for example, 2 new raid zones in the game at release with 17 bosses. I think 16 we said at the time. It's actually going to be 17. We found room for an extra one. So High Maul is actually a 7-boss raid now, not a 6-boss raid.
Okay, I will write that down.
Sure, but and ultimately we've just been making the content. We've been designing out the bosses, making the encounters, testing them, figuring out class balance, all that fun stuff. So I think the specific mobs that I think you're referring to are actually not 100% final. Mm-hmm. The Iron Horde, the guys with the shotguns that fire like a cone blast that you can strafe out of the way of. So I think those may still be changed a bit. Ultimately, for casters, we do want to reduce the number of instant spells. Some of that is on the side of healers. It has some PvP implications also. On the PvP side of things, in our game in Mists of Pandaria right now, healers can often keep themselves alive without ever having to cast a cast time spell. Mm-hmm. And part of the whole point of casting a cast time spell is that you open yourself up to being interrupted. And if you never have to do that, it really messes with the balance. On the PvE side of things, a lot of it is melee versus ranged balance. I think historically one of the great advantages of melee is that they could do almost all their damage and all their effectiveness while moving. Whereas ranged, if you suddenly had to move, maybe you could cast one Fire Blast as a mage, and then you just had to wait until that came off cooldown, or you got to where you wanted to go. Whereas over time, we've been giving people more and more ability to do damage while moving, and that has hurt the balance there a little bit. So I think, it's definitely a good point of feedback. We may have designed. I'm almost certain that creature was designed around the time of BlizzCon, mm-hmm. before a lot of the class changes were in place and before we removed a lot of instants. And so it's always one of the dangers when you have a lengthy development process where we design a portion of the game around one set of class abilities or expectations, then the classes change, and we don't have a chance to go back and update the content. In this case, though, we are going to be doing that. And actually, many pure classes. There are mage talents that are different whether you're fire, frost, or arcane. I think the thought is, it's sort of an evolution of our talent system. We realized that in many cases we were having to, certainly for hybrids, and if you're a priest, you've probably experienced this, take a talent like From Darkness Comes Light, where really it's two separate talents that we're trying to fit into one tooltip, because something that you would offer a healer is really very different from what a DPS wants. And when trying to make talents that appeal to both specs, we either had to go down the route of often kind of watering them down and making them kind of bland so that both people could use them, or just making it do two separate things. And so rather than have that awkwardness of fitting two separate things into one spell, we're just saying when it makes sense, not in all cases, but when it makes sense and when we get more interesting choices out of it, we will fork it and have one spec with one talent option, another spec with a different one. The level 100 talents almost all work that way, and in some cases where we're going back and revisiting rows that were introduced in Mists of Pandaria, we're probably going to see that as well. If you want one change that's being discussed, for example, on the mage front, is reworking. There's a mage talent row that has all the bomb spells in it. It's Nether Tempest, Living Bomb, and Frost Bomb, and that ends up feeling like a kind of bland choice right now since they're all very similar. One thought was to actually consolidate all three of those talents into one single option, where Fire Mages get Living Bomb, Arcane Mages get Nether Tempest, Frost Mages get Frost Bomb, and then put two other talents in that row that would be new talents. So that could be an example of something where we see that in older rows. It means that in Warlords of Draenor you'll be seeing female orcs that have brown skin, because all of the orcs in Draenor, except for Gul'dan and a couple of others, have brown skin. And we're using these player models as a full replacement everywhere that race occurs in the world. So you're not going to see an old human NPC next to a brand new human player character. It's going to be replaced universally. That is not currently the plan for Warlords of Draenor, though we've definitely heard player interest in some type of sub-races, and whether that means brown-skinned orcs or high elves or... Iron Dwarves. Exactly. That could be very cool, and it's something that our artists get really excited when we talk about. So I think the heroic dungeons in Mists of Pandaria were definitely a bit too easy for many players, but we were forced into that to an extent by our choice to not have normal mode versions of the max level dungeons. So if you wanted to do a max level dungeon in Mists of Pandaria, like Siege of Nizhao Temple, let's say, you had to do it in heroic. There was no normal, which meant that heroic really had to be accessible to everyone, because if the heroic version was too hard for you, then you just plain couldn't do the dungeon and you had no other option. In Warlords, we are going to offer normal mode difficulty at level 100, and then separate heroic versions of those dungeons. So I think normal mode is going to be pretty easy, kind of like what heroics were in Mists, but the heroic dungeons we can make more challenging. We're going to tune Looking for Raid in Warlords to expect and require gear from normal mode dungeons. So if you can't do heroic dungeons because you find them too hard, it doesn't matter. You can still qualify for LFR and progress that way. And we see kind of two parallel progression tracks. The mostly solo player who does random match-made content and maybe is a bit more casual about their gameplay can gear up in normal mode dungeons and scenarios and go into LFR. Whereas players who are looking for a bit more of an involved, cooperative 5-player environment can gear up in heroic dungeons and move on to normal mode raid. And then we, of course, will also have challenge mode, which will remain, I think, a fairly difficult version of all of our dungeons. Yeah. And one thing that we're adding, or we're rather going to have available from the outset with regard to challenge modes in Warlords, is that doing the random daily challenge mode quest will award you a piece of epic gear that is on par with or better than LFR loot, even before LFR has opened up and become accessible, even before maybe even the raids have opened up and become accessible. So players, and there's no requirement to complete it with a gold or silver time or anything, you just get that for completing the dungeon, period. So players who are looking for a challenging dungeon experience that's going to give them raid quality loot may just do challenge modes for that. So yes, we're using, certainly for level up, we're going to use a number of single player scenarios, kind of like we saw in the Isle of Thunder story progression. At the end of a lot of major zone quest arcs, there'll be an epic single player scenario that kind of finishes up the story and gives you an epic fight against some final boss or other. We are making max level scenarios, and Currently, we don't have any plans to include level up versions of those, but I think we may reconsider that once we see how they turn out. I think our focus is really on making them an interesting replayable experience for max level. And if it turns out that that also translates well with a lower level version, I could see that also working out well. But we don't currently have anything to announce one way or the other. Yes, well, I mean, I think those are the two main ones that we really have to talk about right now, and I think we're probably going to continue using that type of model with any future raid zones that we do. So High Mall is very thoroughly nonlinear. It's a layout that's pretty similar to Firelands, where you have an open outdoor area with 5 bosses, some of which are optional, which you can skip entirely if you want. Others you can do in whatever order you choose. Once you've defeated those, then there's 2 final bosses that you do have to do last. Blackrock Foundry is a bit similar to the second part of Icecrown Citadel in its structure. There are 3 main wings with 3 bosses each. You can do those wings in any order you want. Once you've cleared all 3 wings, then you can get access to Blackhand, who's the final boss. And we want to keep doing that type of structure because it offers much more freedom and flexibility in your progression. It lets you, explore the zone as you choose. I think it also helps the zone feel a bit more organic, like a living place. When everything is in a perfectly straight line, it kind of reminds you that this is just a dungeon in a video game and not a real place that has a purpose in the world. You'll know eventually. When we see what the final boss is, you can look back and either you'll be right or they'll be right, and we'll see.
All right.
I can tell you somewhat more about this. We certainly aren't planning on having a separate raid tier for each warlord, and more than one warlord may make an appearance in even this first raid tier. I can think of the very least 2, if not 3, that you may end up fighting just in 6.0. Because of a couple of reasons. So first off, remember, this isn't a time travel setup in the sense of actions in the past directly affecting the future.
Yeah.
It's not like going back and killing Gul'dan and Draenor is somehow going to change the reality for orcs living in Azeroth in the main timeline. And Gul'dan isn't your threat in Warlords of Draenor. Grommash is in the Iron Horde. And in fact, Gul'dan could even be an ally against them. We'll have to see. Galleon or Nalak and Undasta. I think we are going to... I don't think that our attempts at a quote-unquote hard outdoor world boss have worked out very well. I think that, honestly, Shav Anger, the first one, may have actually been the most successful world boss of the whole expansion. Just in terms of, being accessible, feeling kind of epic. It gave players who were leveling up through Kunlai the opportunity to see this huge thing and a whole raid group of max level players fighting it, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to do world bosses again in the first place. One thing that we're looking at doing, instead of sort of an easy and a hard one that released at the same time, is actually, for 6.0 at least, we're planning 3 world bosses that will unlock at different points in time over the course of the patch or over the tier. Okay. So there might be just one boss available initially that drops some high mall quality gear. Then a few weeks later, a second world boss could unlock that drops foundry quality gear. And maybe much later in the tier, there's a third world boss that has some heroic grade quality gear available. But by that point, progression's probably done, but the gear still is relevant and useful for players who are trying to catch up or don't do that type of content. I think one of the problems we often struggled with was if the boss over-rewarded, like Ordos in 5.4 today, it offers gear that's just better than anything you can get if you're not a high-end raider. And that diminishes the importance of raid zones. Alternately, if it's not that good, once players start raiding, the world boss is almost irrelevant because everyone has much better stuff. So hopefully this way we can let the rewards from the world bosses scale over the course of the tier by unlocking new ones.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. My pleasure.